It took Star Trek 27 years to move on from the Enterprise. The Enterprise is the most recognizable ship name in the Star Trek franchise, as proven by the fact it took almost 30 years for an episode to be released that didn't feature any version of the iconic vessel. The name Enterprise doesn't necessarily refer to a specific ship within the franchise's storied canon. There are over 10 vessels named Enterprise in official lore, which goes some way to explaining why the title shows up so often throughout the Star Trek timeline. That said, it's still surprising the saga took so long to move away from the famous line of ships. Whenever there is an Enterprise in a Star Trek movie or TV show, it's almost always at the heart of the story. However, there are exceptions to this. For example, Star Trek Picard Season 3's ending introduced the USS Enterprise G to the franchise with Captain 7 of 9 Jerry Ryan as the ship's commanding officer, just as the show concluded. This revelation quietly set up the much-desired Star Trek legacy, but such a project has yet to receive the green light. Regardless, the franchise has arguably heard enough of the ship name, which could account for Legacy's delay. Deep Space Nine's past prologue was the first episode with no Enterprise whatsoever. Star Trek, the original series' cast got the franchise started in 1966 aboard the USS Enterprise. Captain James T. Kirk William Shatner and his crew embarked on countless adventures that all featured the famous vessel, and they continued to explore in the now canon Star Trek, the animated series. After TOS ended, the TV branch of the franchise turned its attention to the USS Enterprise D when Star Trek: The Next Generation began in 1987. All 7 seasons of TNG adopted its predecessor's Enterprise-heavy approach, so it took until Star Trek: Deep Space Nine for this streak to come to an end. The short crossover between Star Trek: The Next Generation and Star Trek: Deep Space Nine meant the latter began the year before the former ended. So to aid in the transition between the shows, Stewart's Picard made an appearance in DS9's 2-part pilot episode, along with his ship, the USS Enterprise D. Therefore, it wasn't until Star Trek: Deep Space Nine Season 1's past prologue that the franchise released an episode without an appearance from any Enterprise. Past prologue marked a big turning point in the franchise, as it no longer became necessary to have an Enterprise in every episode. Of course, more episodes of Star Trek: The Next Generation did air after past prologue, but the streak had already been broken by then. Star Trek Voyager came next, which had a new ship to focus on, but then Star Trek Enterprise retroactively installed the Enterprise NX-1 as the first Starfleet ship to canonically bear the name. In the saga's modern era, the Enterprise has continued that inconsistent pattern of appearances. Star Trek returned with Star Trek Discovery in 2017, and Captain Pike Anson Mount brought the USS Enterprise back at the end of Season 1 and remained as part of the story for Season 2. Mount went on to be central in Star Trek: Strange New Worlds, which brought the franchise back to its focus on ships named Enterprise. However, other projects like Star Trek Prodigy, Star Trek Lower Decks, and Star Trek Picard either had no involvement or only passing dalliances with the most famously named ships in Star Trek. For over a quarter of a century, Star Trek was defined by a single silhouette, the USS Enterprise. Sleek, fast, noble, a vessel with a saucer-shaped head and warp nacelles stretched out like arms racing toward the future. The Enterprise wasn't just a ship, it was a promise. From the original series in 1966 to the final episode of Star Trek Enterprise in 2005, the franchise clung to its flagship like it was a lifeline through the stars. And in many ways, it was. But for 27 years, the question lingered like a starfield on the view screen. Could Star Trek exist without the Enterprise? The answer, eventually, was yes. But it didn't come easily. The starship that launched a legacy, it all began with the USS Enterprise and CC-1701, captained by the intrepid James T. Kirk. More than a setting, the Enterprise was a character, one with its own rhythms, quirks, and presence. For millions of fans, its corridors were as familiar as their own homes. When the Next Generation launched in 1987, the baton was passed to the Enterprise D under the thoughtful stewardship of Jean-Luc Picard. Even as crew members changed and the politics of the galaxy shifted, the Enterprise remained a constant, a symbol of Starfleet's ideals: exploration, diplomacy, and calculated risk. Throughout the 90s, even when Deep Space Nine and Voyager dared to focus elsewhere, the former on a stationary space station, the latter on a ship lost in the Delta Quadrant, the gravitational pull of the Enterprise endured. In films, it returned again and again, upgraded and rebooted, its name always prefixed with reverence. Why we couldn't let go. The Enterprise was safe. It was the visual shorthand for everything Star Trek represented. Letting go of the Enterprise felt like letting go of hope itself, like asking Gotham to move on from the bat signal or Doctor Who to give up the TARDIS. It was the house in which decades of characters had grown up. How do you build something new when the old house still stands, proud and inviting? Part of the challenge was emotional. The Enterprise carried weight, not just in universe prestige, but fandom legacy. Every explosion, every warp jump, every captain's log was a brick in the temple of its myth. For creators, abandoning the Enterprise was risky. To some fans, it was borderline sacrilegious. The turning point. Then something changed. When Star Trek Discovery premiered in 2017, it seemed at first to stick to the familiar. Set just before Kirk's time, it even teased its own version of the Enterprise, with Captain Pike taking the helm in Season 2. But beneath the nostalgia, there was a subtle shift. Discovery wasn't about the Enterprise. It had its own ship, its own technology, and its own increasingly bizarre and bold trajectory. Still, the true breakaway moment wouldn't arrive until Star Trek, Picard, and Star Trek Strange New Worlds began reshaping the franchise from the inside out. Then came Star Trek Prodigy, aimed at younger audiences and following a motley crew of alien teens learning the ways of Starfleet aboard the experimental USS Protostar. The shift was unmistakable. The future of Star Trek no longer required the Enterprise as its narrative anchor. Finally, in 2023, Star Trek Lower Decks, an irreverent animated series, took the final step. It referenced the Enterprise, of course, but its focus on the USS Cerritos and its underdog crew proved you could live in the world of Star Trek without living in its shadow. The Cerritos wasn't sleek or legendary. It was awkward, underfunded, and staffed by screw-ups. And yet, it was also Star Trek, through and through. Moving on doesn't mean forgetting. Letting go of the Enterprise didn't mean dishonoring it. Quite the opposite, it meant trusting the audience to believe in Star Trek's deeper principles. The ideals of curiosity, moral courage, and cooperative problem-solving never needed a specific ship to carry them. They were always bigger than any nacelle or warp core. The irony is that by finally moving beyond the Enterprise, Star Trek rediscovered the very essence that made it special. Without the burden of legacy, the stories got weirder, more diverse, more personal. There was room for emotional arcs, for flawed characters, for spiritual questions, and ethical quagmires that wouldn't fit neatly on a gleaming bridge. A universe, not just a ship. After 27 years tethered to the Enterprise, Star Trek is finally breathing in the fullness of its universe. Strange New Worlds are no longer visited from just one iconic ship. They're discovered through different eyes, from different cultures, and with different stakes. That's not to say the Enterprise won't return. It always does. Just like the Federation, just like Hope. But its monopoly is over. The future belongs to more than one starship now. And in that diversity lies the true future of the franchise. It took a long time, but Star Trek has finally,